change.
Even I was crying.
Yeah, it was like divorce.
I remember what was an SMS that was supposed to have been passed around. Rosa
Here,
sat.
here. Mike.
Can you hear me? Okay. I remember what was an SMS that was passed around in the U.S. apparently. Rosa sat so Martin could walk. Martin walked so Obama could run. Obama could run so your children can fly. And I suppose that's the emotional part of it.
Right. Yeah. And it's also problematic to assume that the individuals are capable of that kind of...
But sometimes we need individuals to symbolize things. You know?
We do.
I remember you mentioned Du Bois. I once was very interested. I was once very interested in I am still interested in the comparison between Du Bois and Omvedt. You know, both were brilliant leaders, scholars as well as activists, trying to integrate race and caste with class and other issues. At the end of his life, incidentally, Omvedt had written Du Bois, asked he wanted to bring the issue of caste and untouchability to the UN. It took years, decades after that to do it. But the differences, I was there in the degree of political success they had in their own countries. And I think this is something about the trajectory of movements. Because I was shocked when I read that Du Bois had applied for a position as assistant postmaster in Washington and didn't get it. Whereas Omvedt could become a minister first under the British and then an independent India. I think there the difference was that because India was also fighting an anti-colonial war, the elite had to pay some attention to the question of caste. Whereas in U.S. at the time, African Americans were mostly isolated. It really seems that it was not until the 60s and most African countries became independent and there was a worldwide focus that the civil rights movement could take off. Whereas in India, in one sense, with independence, the opposite happened. So maybe we're also, talking about different trajectories of movements here. What it's going to be ahead of time, the Indian movement, to my mind, in the last couple of decades, U.S. has made far more progress in the question of race, not that racism has ended, but than India has. India, a lot of things remain very problematic. For instance, leave aside atrocities and caste tensions, but the fact that manual excrement is still hauled away manually by members of one particular elite community is still there. Shit work, you can say. The worst job in the world, as one of the activists called it. So, and we don't have the data, as I said, because of the problems, not only about caste in the census, but about sociological studies. Intermarriage. I'd like to know how many intermarriages there are actually in India, what % of intermarriages there are. There are some very visible ones, but the percentage seems small. But we don't have that kind of data. In contrast, it seems to me that there has been that kind of progress, movement forward in the U.S. Maybe now it's only starting in India.
But I know I referred to the progress we've made, and I think I said what progress and racial justice we have achieved. I think that progress has been primarily for individuals, as opposed to structural change. And in many ways, I think I have to say this, but the racism is even more entrenched. In many ways, it's worse today. And that would be borne out by looking at the statistics regarding poverty, but by looking at the extent to which racism is so embedded, so deeply embedded in institutional structures that it's no longer possible to recognize it. And we can say that race really matters when it comes to determining who's going to go to prison and who's going to the university. However, it doesn't happen explicitly because of race. And we haven't developed the kind of vocabulary that allows us to talk about the prison and the educational system and it's not only a disparity between the actual prison system and the educational system, it's that education for young Black, Latino, poor people begins to replicate the prison so that the schools focus more on discipline than they do on teaching kids how to read and write and how to embrace knowledge. What they learn in these schools, and if I had time, I could describe what it means to be a kid in an elementary school where there are armed guards patrolling the corridors, where you have to go through a metal detector in order to get into the classroom.
Went to 2 years of high school in Minneapolis. And yes, they had the metal detector, they had the facilities for unwed mothers, but they also had 6 foreign languages, including Chinese, Russian, 2 Native American languages, and she got a good education there. So I think the picture is mixed. Yeah, I'm not trying to say, but
I'm specifically talking about schools in certain communities.
Huh?
I'm specifically talking about the way schools look in certain communities. And in in poor Black communities, they look very differently. Even if you do have the modes of surveillance and metal detectors in schools that where you might have more education available, they're not the same because
this was a racially mixed school. But
well, now we talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, where there are schools that really allow children to move into the juvenile system. It's the first stage is the school, the second stage is the juvenile justice system, and then the third stage is the adult prison.
So, what? Okay, I think we've got a signal about time. I don't know, well, we haven't? No, okay.
Well, I mean, this is the beginning of a conversation. And as you can see, there are a lot of issues that we might explore, and I really appreciate this opportunity to engage in this way.
We've just barely scratched the surface, probably. There are certainly important changes happening in terms of caste, but we don't have time to discuss these now. I think we're basically at the end of our program. So I thank you all for coming and listening quietly, and Anand will say a few final words. Thank you, Angela.
And thank you, Gail. Thank you.
Most of all, thank you, Angela. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, everybody, for having come here. Thank you. Bye.